Welcome to Ground Control. This is going to be the final video in the review series for the MinimumRC B-25 Michell bomber. And this video specifically is to give you some tips on the build process and also on the setup, how to avoid a couple of mistakes that I made on the build, what I think would be a good setup for your maiden flight, and also the setup that I'm currently flying with that you saw in the last video. MinimumRC, on their site, they have a nice build guide that you can download. It's a PDF file. It's a fairly general step-by-step guide on the assembly of the plane, and it's fairly adequate for building the airframe, but there are some items that I want to give you that were not quite clear in the build guides. So first thing you want to do is verify everything. Make sure that you test your motors, make sure that you measure your props, because I didn't, and that was my oversight. I had improper props that were packed in the kit. They should have been 65mm props, not 60mm props. Had I measured those props beforehand, I would have been able to get 65mm props on this plane before I did the initial maiden flight, and it would have gone much more smoothly. So that was my oversight, and that shouldn't have happened. Make sure that when you're assembling your plane that you dry fit everything. Dry fit everything, make sure there's no binding, make sure everything fits properly before you start gluing it together. The control surfaces are not pre-beveled, so you're going to have to bevel the control surfaces 45 degrees on the underside of the aileron where the hinge line is, and also on the elevator. And I beveled mine just with the utility knife 45 degrees. Make sure that, just move your control surfaces, make sure you have plenty of downward deflection before you do anything else. Assemble the fuselage with the front landing gear. The landing gear actually sandwiches between the layers of foam, so make sure you do that. I wish that I had moved my strut on my front landing gear forward toward the nose about 5mm. That would also have helped with getting the CG correct without having to move the battery so far forward. And the same thing with the rear landing gear. I wish that I had moved my rear landing gear about 5mm further forward. There's a line just in front of where my strut's coming out of the foam. And if you look at the picture on their guide of the completed airframe, that'll show you precisely where I should have put my struts. So moving the nose gear and the rear landing gear forward 5mm would have definitely helped with that forward CG. So don't forget that. Once your fuselage is glued together, there's 3 different layers of foam. What I always do, once I get everything glued together, I make sure all the edges are all flush, and then I lay it down flat on my cutting board, and I put a book or something heavy across the top of it. Just put a sheet of wax paper underneath it so nothing sticks, and on the top of it, and I do that to keep everything nice and flat and straight as the glue is setting up. You don't want to just glue it, let it lay, and then find out that it's slightly warped after the glue is set up. So do that with your fuselage, and also do that with your nacelles, because there's 3 layers on the nacelles as well. When you're installing your rear struts, landing gear struts, into your nacelles, what I did was I took both the nacelles and I put them back to back, flipped them upside down, and made sure that I had my rear struts at precisely the same location in both of the nacelles. They were both straight up off of the nacelles, and they were both the exact same length. So you want to make sure that before your glue sets up on your nacelles that you've got your rear landing gear struts positioned so that everything is nice and straight, same position, same length coming out of the nacelles. You don't want your plane to be sitting crooked once you get everything together. I like to center up all my servos. Part of your testing your electronics, make sure that you center up your servos, and that's when I like to put the control arms on my servos, so that I know that my control arms are in the correct position when I install the servos, that everything is nice and centered and straight, and having the control arm on the servo beforehand gives me a visual indication that that servo is centered before I ever start attaching my control rods to the servos and the control horns. They have a cutout in the top of the wing for the elevator control horn on the servo. I had plenty of room on mine to orient the servo control arm in a downward position rather than an upward position coming through the top of the wing. So I chose to do that. And it was easier if I installed the servo into the fuselage once the fuselage assembly was complete and the glue was set up, and have my arm oriented downward, because once you install the wing and the nacelle, it's really hard to get a screwdriver in there to tie down the servo and then attach the control arm to the servo. So what I'm going to do with this little cutout in the wing is I'm going to take a piece of the scrap foam that I cut the pieces out of. I'm just going to paint it black, and then I'm going to glue it in there in the wing so there's no hole in there. And that works fine. I don't think it makes any difference whether you have your elevator control arm on your servo oriented upward or oriented downward. I mean, it worked fine for me. And that way I don't have a control rod coming across the top of my wing. So that was my preference on that. I also, one thing that I did was I installed my nacelles on the wings after installing the carbon spars on the wings. I installed these at the same time. I installed the carbon spars on my wings, and because your wing has this angle where it goes into the side of the fuselage, if you can see that, I installed the carbon spar, glued in the carbon spar on the wing, got that angle, and then I slid the nacelle on top of the wing and glued all that together at one time, and then the nacelle will hold that angle of the wing that you're going to need when you install it into the side of the fuselage. I found that it was easier doing that. You want to make sure that you do not install your control horns on your main wing until you have your nacelles installed. And on my nacelles, on the main wings, there were these little divots that were cut all the way through the foam on one edge, and then over on the other edge were about the same distance apart as the nacelle is thick. So I thought, well, those are alignments for the nacelles. A good assumption, but I think that was incorrect. So I think what I should have done with my nacelles, and I'm not sure why those divots are in the wing, because I do not believe that those are alignment holes for the nacelles. I should have installed the nacelles all the way to the edge of the main wing where the cutout is for the ailerons. There would have been two benefits to doing it that way. Number one, it would have set a little bit lower at the back of the plane so that you had a slight nose up attitude, because the main wing has dihedral in it, and the further out on the wing the nacelles are, of course, the lower the back of the plane is going to be. So that would have made it easier, I think, for takeoffs from the ground if I would have pulled the nacelles out another 5 millimeters, and would have given me that slight nose upward tilt that would have made it easier to take off from the ground. The second benefit to doing that is that the edge of your prop is going to be further away from your fuselage. And if you decide to put in 3-inch props instead of 2.5-inch props, it's going to give you better clearance for those 3-inch props, and you want to keep the props as far away from that battery on the side of the fuselage as you can. So I would definitely, if I had to do it again, I would definitely move those nacelles out to where the cutout is for the aileron, and that would have been 5 millimeters further out. So take that into consideration. Make sure that when you install your nacelles and when you install your landing gear into your nacelles, that you have everything oriented properly. Because if you see, the servos are pointing outward toward the tip of the wing. So you want to make sure, and so you want your axle on your struts on your rear landing gear also installed into the nacelle, so that the axle is pointing toward the tip of the wing. Don't get those reversed on your nacelles. and don't get your nacelles reversed on your wings so that your servos are not facing outward. Okay, so keep that in mind when you're putting your nacelles and your struts together and where your cutouts are for your servos at the time. Now once all that's done, once the nacelles are all glued together and they're installed in the wings, that's the point in time where I would install my control horns. And you can install your control horn on your horizontal stabilizer because you can slide it into the fuselage from either side. And it's easier to install your control horns when you've got your wings and your horizontal stabilizer out of the fuselage, because there's just not a lot of space to work with, especially on the control horn for the elevator. It's kind of cumbersome to try to get the control horns in there after the wings and the horizontal stabilizer are installed. Also make sure that you install your horizontal stabilizer before you install your vertical stabilizers. The vertical stabilizers were the absolute last thing that I installed on the airframe after getting it together. I even had the landing gear, I had the wheels and the tires and everything installed on the landing gear before I ever installed the vertical stabilizers. So, okay, so here are some notes that I wrote down that I did for my build of this plane. I used super glue for the two wood halves that make up the wheel for each tire on the landing gear. There's going to be two little pieces of wood. Make sure that you put something about the same diameter as the axle where the wheels are going to fit onto, because these holes are tiny, 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 and they're hard to get lined up just perfectly. So what I would do is get a piece of wire that's the same diameter as the axle you're going to be sliding the wheel onto. Put that through both halves of the wheel, then super glue those two halves of the wheel together. You know, if the super glue sticks to the piece of wire you have, all you've got to do is rotate the wheels and that'll break free. But you want to make sure that both halves of that wheel have the holes lined up, or you're going to have a hard time getting them on the axles. So glue those together first, wait until those dry, and then super glue the wood wheels into the foam tire. That's the way I did it. It made it a lot easier. I had two types of glue with my kit. One was super glue and one is just a foam safe glue. And use that glue sparingly, because by the time that I got my airframe all completed, I had very little glue left. So they've got that down to a science. You know, there's not going to be much glue left by the time that you get your airframe all put together, so use it sparingly. On my wheels, rather than bending I didn't want to bend the ends of the axles up, because I was afraid, number one, either I wouldn't get them tight enough or I would get them too tight. If you get them too tight, then your wheels are going to bind, they're not going to roll freely, and if you don't get them tight enough, they're going to wobble back and forth. So what I decided to do was I took a little piece of straw from one of those little spray cans like WD-40, and it had almost the same diameter hole as the axle, and so I cut sections off of that were 2 millimeters thick, and then I put those on, snugged up the wheels so that they would roll freely, but so they wouldn't wobble back and forth. And then I put a little bit of glue on the back side of those little plastic wheel locks and on the tip of the axle. And so far they've held up really well, and it rolls real nice on the wheels. So just household material that I use to do that with. When I was assembling the control rods, it comes with a section of heat shrink for connecting your wire Z-bends to the control horns and the servo control arms, and you basically heat shrink those onto that little piece of carbon rod. But the carbon rod is really, really slick. So what I did was I took some additional heat shrink that I had, and I put a piece of heat shrink on the end of each piece of the carbon rod before I heat shrink the wire Z-bends on. So it's got heat shrink underneath the Z-bends and heat shrink over top of the Z-bends, and that adds friction so that those things aren't going to be sliding back and forth on that slick carbon rod, and that has worked out really well. They have not moved at all. So you might want to do that. Just a little tip on your assembly of your control rods. I don't trust just having a little thin piece of paper for my control hinges. So what I did was I just took links of Scotch tape and I went right over top of where the hinge lines are on the ailerons and the elevator, just to enforce those. Now, unfortunately, I didn't have any completely transparent tape, so you can see mine. But if you got some completely transparent Scotch tape, I think it will hardly be noticeable reinforcement on your hinge lines for your aileron and your elevator. I would not just trust the paper. I would put tape over top of that. On the notch cutout for the horizontal stabilizer, and this is another reason I say dry fit everything together before you glue it. So I dry fitted my horizontal stabilizer into the fuselage, and the notch on the elevator right next to the fuselage was snug enough that it was binding on the end of the fuselage. So what I did was I just cut out 1 to 2 millimeters of material on either side of that notch, and now I've got plenty of clearance between the elevator and the fuselage, so there's not going to be any chance of binding on it. Now yours may not be that way, but dry fit it and see, dry fit it and move your elevator up and down and make sure that it's not close enough to the fuselage that it's going to bind when it's moving. After the glue cured on the nacelles and on the fuselage, what I did was I took a dab of glue and I went around the base of the struts where they go into the foam and around the foam, just to add a little bit additional support, because that wire is pretty thin and I didn't want it to break loose inside the layers of foam. So just put a little additional dab of glue all the way around the base of the strut and on the foam, and I think that'll add enough reinforcement that you won't have any problem with it. After I glued in my nacelles, and where I have mine positioned, like I said, I wish I would have moved them out further. They're 5 millimeters farther in toward the fuselage from where the cutout is for the ailerons. Now I didn't realize this, but this wood support, wing support that goes through the fuselage had notches in it, and I didn't realize that at the time. So after everything's set up and I was getting ready to install the electronics and I went to install the servo into the nacelle, the edge of the servo was hitting that notch and I couldn't get it seated in all the way. So I actually had to take my X-Acto blade and I had to carve off that notch on that wood support for the main wing in order to get my servo seated all the way into the nacelle. Now I think if I would have installed the nacelles out there to where that cutout is, 5 millimeters further out toward the tip of the wing, where the aileron cutout is, I think that I would have had enough space to completely seat that servo where it would have been right up against that notch on the wood wing support. So don't forget that. Make sure that you have your nacelle placed all the way out there where that cutout is, because that was another problem I ran into because I didn't do that. Make sure that when you install your receiver and your battery, make sure that your receiver is on one side of the fuselage, and make sure that your battery placement is going to be on the other side of the fuselage, so that your battery is offsetting the weight of the receiver and the receiver is offsetting the weight of the battery. I also made sure that I had my receiver pulled forward up to the leading edge of the wing to also help me get that forward CG that you're going to need on that. Set up on the control surfaces. Set your CG 10 millimeters back from the leading edge of the wing, and like I said, I like to test my CG balance at the same spot each time just to make sure nothing changes. And 10 millimeters back is about where the second line is on the wing, just where it intersects or is tangent to this blue circle where the star is. So I have mine set back 13 millimeters from the leading edge. That's where I like it. But for your maiden flight, I would definitely set it at 10 millimeters, test it, see if you like it there. I felt it was just ever so slightly nose heavy at 10 millimeters, but I think most people prefer planes to fly a little, just slightly bit nose heavy. So start off there. The deflection for the ailerons in each direction. I would set the deflection of my ailerons at 4 millimeters in each direction, 4 millimeters up, 4 millimeters down. I have mine set at a higher limit than that, but mine are very responsive, and I think for your maiden flight, you probably want to set them at about 4. I think that will make them not so abrupt for your maiden flight, and then you could always adjust from there. On the elevator, my suggestion for the elevator, so that you have enough control authority to flare that plane when you're coming in for a landing, is set your elevator at 7 millimeters up, 7 millimeters down for your deflection, and then test it and adjust from there. On my setup, on my ailerons, I have 7 millimeters of deflection, top and bottom. Like I said, mine are very responsive, and I like having that much movement and responsiveness in the ailerons. But for your maiden flight, I would go with what I already recommended. But I have 7 millimeters deflection each direction on mine. On my elevator, I have 9 millimeters of deflection in both direction, and I have expo of 45 in both, in the ailerons and the elevator. Okay, so setup on the control rods, on the servo arms, and on the control horns. On the ailerons. On the ailerons, you want your connector at the bottom hole on the control arm for the servo, and at the top hole on the control horn. And that's going to give you the greatest amount of mechanical advantage, and it's also going to give you the greatest amount of resolution on the movement of your aileron. And you're going to want that, because without doing that, the ailerons for me were just a little bit too responsive. So that's a way of toning down the movement of your ailerons, so they're much smoother that way. And it has the advantage, it has the benefit of giving you the greatest amount of mechanical advantage. On the elevator, the problem I had with the elevator was I wasn't getting enough deflection on the elevator. So my control rod connections on the servo and the control horn for the elevator is on the servo is on the top hole of the control arm, so that I get the longest arc, the greatest amount of movement. And on the control horn, on the bottom hole, the hole that's closest to the elevator, and that gives me the greatest amount of movement. It's not the greatest amount of mechanical advantage, but it gives me the greatest amount of movement on the elevator, which is what I needed. So anyway, that concludes the review, the tips, and the setup for the MinimumRC B-25 Michell bomber. I'm having a blast with it now. I like the way it handles now, the way I've got it set up, where I have the CG, where I have the deflection on the ailerons and the elevator. I think it's a great little design, and it looks great in the air. And I think MinimumRC did a fantastic job with this airframe. So test out your power system. Make sure that you've got 65 millimeter props on it, and take it out for your Maiden with the default power system with proper props on it, and see what you think about the power system. If you live in an area of the country where you have frequently have calm winds, then you may not have a problem with it. But I can count the number of calm wind days we have where I live on one hand. So I'm always flying in wind, and when you're flying in wind, you want more power. So that's my only complaint. I wish I had more power, but I'm going to be installing more power on this plane, and then I think it will be absolutely perfect for me. So thanks for watching. Please give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe. Links to everything are in the show notes, and I will see you in the air.